She washed cars with her child on her back, battling the cold for survival. A stranger stood beside her and began to help, hiding who he really was. But the truth that came to light later changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The city was wrapped in the grip of winter, a season that spared no one its cruel indifference. Snow lay in layers along the sidewalks, gray and hardened from passing boots and tires, while the air itself seemed to freeze in place, brittle and sharp, biting the skin of anyone who dared linger outdoors for long. In the heart of this city, amidst the wealth of gleaming skyscrapers and the forgotten corners where survival was carved from frost and hunger, a man walked slowly, his breath curling in faint clouds around his face. He wore a coat tailored in Europe, the kind that marked him instantly as someone of means, though today he had left behind the entourage and the shield of chauffeurs. There were times, rare but necessary, when he needed to feel the world without the distortion of privilege, to remember what life looked like for those who lived without the insulation of millions. His name was Adrian Cole, known in the circles of business as a man who had built an empire in less than 2 decades. Shareholders respected him, rivals feared him, and employees seldom saw him except as a figure framed by boardroom glass. But beneath the image, Adrian carried a silence that no amount of success could quiet. His childhood had been one of scarcity, days when bread was stretched across too many mouths, and shoes had to last longer than they were ever meant to. He had risen from those days with relentless determination, swearing he would never feel that kind of helplessness again. Yet now, with accounts swollen and property spread across continents, he found himself hollow in ways no deal could fill. The people around him smiled with polished teeth, laughed at the right cues, but their loyalty was only ever to his fortune. He longed, though he scarcely admitted it, to touch something real again. It was on one of these solitary walks that Adrian's life began to turn. The wind drove hard that afternoon, cutting against his face as he turned down a side street not far from the river. He might have missed her if not for the glint of water splashing against a windshield. A figure bent over a car, a bucket at her feet, steam rising faintly from its rim where the water had been drawn warm and was now surrendering quickly to the cold. The woman's movements were steady but weary, her shoulders hunched not from laziness but from the weight of exhaustion. The fabric tied around her body revealed a shape small and fragile resting against her back. At first he thought it a bundle of cloth, but then a hand twitched, tiny fingers curling in sleep. A child. Adrian stopped without meaning to, as if some invisible hand had caught him mid-stride. He watched the woman wring out a rag, her hands red and raw from the icy water. She pressed the cloth firmly against the glass, rubbing in small circles, determined to make every inch shine. The child stirred, head shifting against her shoulder, but she soothed the movement with a slight sway of her body, never once pausing her work. There was no resentment on her face, no pleading expression begging the world for pity. Only determination. She was fighting silently, with every stroke of her hand against that windshield. A surge of memory rose within him. He remembered his mother, back when he was small, working 2 jobs to keep him and his siblings fed. He remembered how her fingers cracked in the cold, how she came home smelling of soap and metal, how she carried burdens far heavier than she ever spoke of. The sight before him struck something deep that no luxury car or penthouse view could ever soothe. He felt it in his chest like an ache, one that spread outward and made his throat tighten. He could have passed on, as countless others already had. People glanced and turned their heads, pretending not to see, or perhaps simply choosing not to. He could have reached into his pocket and drawn out bills, offered them as a gesture of charity, and left with his conscience lightly eased. But he knew even before he considered it that money pressed into her hands would only demean her. She was not begging. She was surviving. Adrian's steps drew him closer until he stood at the edge of the car she was cleaning. The woman did not notice at first. Her eyes were lowered, fixed on the glass streaking beneath her rag. Then, sensing a presence, she straightened slightly, her gaze lifting to him. For a heartbeat, he thought she might send him away with a glance sharp enough to cut, but her eyes simply held his, dark and guarded, questioning without words. He gave no explanation. Instead, he set down his coat, draped it across the hood of a neighboring car, and rolled up his sleeves. The shock in her eyes was clear, though she said nothing. He reached for the spare sponge that rested in her bucket, gripped it tightly, and began to scrub the side panel of the car beside her. His movements were clumsy at first, unpracticed in this kind of work, but he did not stop. The cold water soaked through the sponge, biting his fingers until they stung. Still, he pushed on, falling into the rhythm she had set, matching her quiet persistence. For a long while, the only sounds were the swish of cloth against metal, the drip of water onto frozen ground, the faint breath of the child against her shoulder. Adrian felt the ache in his arms, the rawness in his skin, and something else too, a release. Here there was no stock market, no quarterly report, no banquet hall full of shallow praise. Here there was only effort, sweat mingled with frost, a simple task done for no reward beyond the shine of clean metal in winter light. He had not realized how much he had needed this. The woman still had not spoken when the car was finished. She rinsed the rag in the bucket, wrung it out with practiced hands, and glanced sideways at him. He could not read all that passed through her expression, but there was something there. Not trust yet, not gratitude, but recognition. He was not mocking her. He was not above her. He was beside her. As the sky darkened into the blue-gray of early evening, Adrian stepped back and flexed his stiff fingers. The child stirred again, lifting a small face for just a moment before burrowing deeper into the fold of cloth. The sight sent another pang through him. He wanted to ask the woman her name, wanted to know how she had come to this corner of the city, how she carried herself with such quiet strength. But he held his tongue. Words felt heavy, unnecessary. What mattered had already been said in silence. When he finally retrieved his coat and prepared to leave, he looked back once more. The woman was already bent over another car, her movements as steady as before. The bucket steamed faintly in the cold, and the child slept on. He walked away into the night, his breath catching in the air, carrying with him an image that refused to fade. He knew with a certainty that startled him that this would not be the last time he returned. The memory of that winter evening refused to loosen its grip on Adrian. He had walked away believing it might have been a single act of impulse, a brief crossing of two paths destined to diverge once more. Yet when he awoke the following morning in his penthouse, surrounded by glass walls that framed the skyline in cold, indifferent beauty, he found himself restless. The silence of his home pressed in on him, and the thought of board meetings and endless voices praising his latest acquisitions seemed suddenly unbearable. What had stayed with him most was not the sting of ice on his hands, nor the stiffness in his shoulders, but the image of her back bent in labor, the child tied securely against her, and the strength in her eyes that refused to yield even as the world froze around her. That strength called to him in ways he could not explain. It was not pity that drove him, nor the shallow curiosity of a rich man wandering into the lives of the poor for amusement. It was something more dangerous, something more alive. And so when evening fell once more, his feet carried him unbidden to the same street corner where he had first seen her. The air was colder that night, wind sharper as it swept down from the river. Streetlights glowed with a tired yellow light, casting halos onto the slick pavement. And there she was again, as though frozen in time, bent over the hood of a sedan, her movements steady, her shoulders braced against fatigue. The child shifted slightly, turning a small face into her mother's coat, and then slept on. Adrian hesitated for a moment, watching from across the street, wondering if she would recognize him or if she would reject his presence. But his hesitation lasted only a moment before he set his coat aside again, picked up the spare sponge, and began working silently at her side. The woman stiffened when she noticed him. For an instant her eyes narrowed, the guard in them sharp and mistrustful, yet she said nothing. Instead, she moved to the next section of glass, as if to test whether he would follow through or vanish after a few swipes. But he did not waver. Side by side they worked, the rhythm of water and cloth binding them once more into a wordless companionship. When at last the car was finished, she cast him a glance that carried something new. It was not warmth, not yet, but neither was it rejection. It was acknowledgement. And for Adrian that was enough, so it became a ritual. Each evening he would appear, and each evening he would take his place beside her without introduction or explanation. Slowly, the tension in her eyes softened, though suspicion never quite left. They worked in silence for days until one evening, as the wind howled down the street, she spoke. Her voice was low, almost swallowed by the sound of cars rushing by. But he heard every word. She told him her name was Elena. It was the first gift of trust she had offered, and Adrian held it close, repeating it silently, savoring the shape of it in his mind. After that first admission, words began to slip into their labor. Not full conversations, not yet, but fragments. She would comment on how many cars had come that day, on how cold the water grew as the hours passed, on how quickly her son, she told him his name was Daniel, fell asleep, no matter how rough the work. Slowly, piece by piece, a story began to form between the silence. Adrian learned she had once been something else entirely, not a woman scrubbing cars on a frozen street, but a project manager in a mid-sized firm, trusted to keep teams running, contracts delivered, systems in order. She had been respected once, valued for her sharp mind and her ability to bring chaos into order. But then came betrayal. Her husband, a man she had trusted with her life, had left her buried in debts she had not created. He had stripped accounts, twisted legal papers, and abandoned her without a backward glance, leaving her with a child in arms and creditors at her door. What she had built over years collapsed in a matter of weeks, and no one had extended a hand. She spoke of it not with bitterness, but with a flatness that chilled Adrian more than anger might have. It was the voice of someone who had endured so long that even outrage had grown numb. Yet beneath that numbness, he could still see the woman she had been, the sharpness in her mind, the resilience in her posture. Even now, bent against winter, she was organizing her survival with the same precision she must once have applied to boardrooms and project deadlines. She arranged cars in order of arrival, remembered which clients preferred speed over thoroughness, rationed soap and water to last until nightfall. Everything about her spoke of discipline and a will that refused to be extinguished. Adrian found himself studying her as much as he worked beside her. He noticed the way she adjusted the cloth around her son with one hand, without breaking rhythm, the way she straightened her back after every third car to stretch muscles that must have ached constantly, the way she managed to keep her head high even when passers-by whispered or glanced at her with disdain. In her, he saw not a victim, but a warrior in the quietest sense, one who fought not with weapons or power, but with persistence that never faltered. As days stretched into weeks, the unspoken bond between them deepened. Adrian felt drawn not only to her strength, but to the absence of pretense. She did not flatter him, did not try to guess at who he was, did not bend herself into shapes to please a man. She treated him as she treated herself, another pair of hands in the cold, another worker scrubbing frost-streaked metal. He had not known how much he craved that simplicity, that unfiltered truth. Around her, he was not Adrian Cole the tycoon, the master of boardrooms. He was just a man with raw hands, trying to keep pace with a woman who never stopped. It was in those nights that he began to feel something grow in him, a stirring that reached beyond fascination or fleeting attraction. He admired her resilience. Yes, but admiration was only the beginning. He found himself anticipating her glances, the moments when her eyes would flicker toward him as if to measure his resolve. He cherished the rare times when her lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile, usually when Daniel giggled in his sleep and shifted against her. Those small cracks in her armor revealed the warmth beneath, and each one drew him closer, binding him with threads invisible but unbreakable. He kept his silence about who he truly was. The temptation to reveal his wealth, to offer her an escape from the frost and the ache, was strong, but he resisted it fiercely. To tell her would be to risk breaking the fragile honesty that had taken root between them. He wanted her to see him not as a rescuer, not as a benefactor, but simply as a man. And more than that, he wanted to see her as she was, unshaped by expectations or the weight of gratitude. So he said nothing, and instead let the nights speak for him. Still, he could not deny the pull that deepened with every passing day. It was no longer enough merely to work beside her. He wanted to know her laughter, to know what her voice sounded like when not muffled by fatigue, to know what dreams she still carried beneath the frost. He wanted to protect her, not with walls of money or titles, but with presence, with loyalty, with something real. And so, though he never said it aloud, he began to plan. Not a plan of conquest, but of offering. A way to show her that her talents, her strength, and her mind were not lost to the world. A way to remind her of the woman she had once been. The winter deepened around them, and with it, their unspoken connection. Each night, Adrian returned to his penthouse with raw hands and a heart fuller than it had been in years. Each morning, he rose with a restless energy that no meeting could satisfy. He had begun, without realizing it, to measure his days not by the contracts he signed, but by the hours until he could see her again. The man who had once thought himself untouchable now found himself bound in the simplest of ways, by the steady rhythm of cloth on glass, the breath of a sleeping child, and the quiet strength of a woman who refused to bow. Adrian knew change was coming. He felt it in the marrow of his bones, as surely as he felt the ache from hours of labor his body was not used to. Their paths had intertwined too tightly to unravel easily now, and though he did not yet know how or when, he understood with absolute certainty that his life was no longer his alone. The weeks of silent labor on frozen streets had built something between them that words could not easily define. Adrian had felt it growing stronger with every evening spent at her side, and with every moment that she entrusted him with fragments of her past. She had spoken of betrayal and ruin as though it were simply another fact of life, but behind the calmness of her tone, he had heard the echoes of someone who once held authority, who once shaped outcomes, who once believed her abilities meant security. The world had stripped her of everything, her livelihood, her dignity, her place in society. But it had not stripped her of the sharp mind he could see flashing, even in the simplest of tasks. It was in the way she managed the queue of cars, the way she anticipated the mood of hurried customers, the way she rationed her supplies so that every drop of soap counted. These were not the instincts of someone born into hardship. They were the habits of someone who had known what it was to lead, and who still carried the instincts of command no matter how life had tried to bury them. Adrian could no longer content himself with merely working beside her. He had tasted the honesty of her presence, the richness of her resilience, but he also saw clearly that this life on the street was draining her strength little by little. She carried her son like a shield, fought each day against exhaustion and cold, and yet behind her composure, he sensed the toll it was taking. He knew in a way that left no doubt that she was capable of more than survival. She was capable of shaping something greater, not just for herself, but for anyone who placed their trust in her. And he resolved that it was time she was given the chance to do so. The thought occupied him in restless nights. He considered and reconsidered how to present it. To reveal himself outright as the owner of a vast corporation risked destroying everything fragile between them. She would feel deceived, perhaps insulted, perhaps even betrayed that he had hidden such a truth. Yet to remain silent meant leaving her in the frost while he stood by, knowing he could change her fate. The balance was delicate, and for the first time in years, Adrian hesitated over a decision. In business, he was decisive, ruthless when necessary, unflinching in the face of risk. But here the stakes were different. This was not a matter of profit or loss, but of trust, and he valued her trust more than any contract he had ever signed. He waited for the right evening, one when the cold was especially bitter and the streets nearly deserted. Daniel stirred more than usual that night, his small hands clutching at his mother's coat as if even in sleep he felt the sharpness of the air. Elena worked slower than usual, her body tired from days that seemed endless. It was then, as he rinsed a sponge in the near-frozen water, that Adrian finally spoke the words that had been forming in him for weeks. He told her she had talent beyond this street, that he had seen in her the skills of someone who could bring order to chaos, and that he wanted her to consider taking work in an office, away from the cruelty of the winter wind. At first she laughed, though there was no humor in it. It was not the sound of someone amused, but the bitter sound of someone too tired to believe in miracles. She told him she had no connections, no papers worth showing, no chance of anyone trusting her again. The business world, once closed, remained closed forever. To hope otherwise was to invite disappointment too sharp to bear. But Adrian did not relent. He pressed her gently, insisting not with the arrogance of one offering charity, but with the quiet conviction of someone who believed in her. He told her that even if she did not believe in herself, she should believe in the proof of her days, that the discipline she showed each night was no less valuable in an office than on the street. At last, reluctant but swayed by the weight of his sincerity, Elena agreed to try. She made it clear she expected nothing, that she would walk away at the first sign of pity or ridicule. Adrian only nodded. He had not intended to win her trust with words alone. He would let the chance itself prove him. When she first walked into the office building, the contrast between her usual world and this one was almost unbearable. The heat pressed against her like a wall after so many months of bitter air. Men and women in suits moved briskly, their eyes sharp, their voices quick with business. She felt out of place in every way, aware of the stares that followed her as she was led down the hallway. They knew who she was, or thought they did. A woman who had been seen scrubbing cars in the cold, now stepping across polished marble floors as though she belonged. The first days were the hardest. Her colleagues whispered, some openly skeptical, others quietly amused. They doubted her background, doubted her worth, doubted that someone like her could contribute to the company's survival, let alone its success. At times, the weight of their disbelief pressed so heavily on her that she nearly faltered. But every time she thought of turning back, she remembered Daniel's small face as he slept against her, and she straightened her back. She had endured worse than whispered scorn. She had endured betrayal, poverty, nights of hunger. What were cold stares compared to that? Slowly, she began to prove herself. She studied the systems they used, absorbing the methods with a swiftness that startled even those determined to dismiss her. She noticed flaws others had overlooked, contracts poorly worded, supply chains riddled with inefficiency, small leaks of money that added up to losses no one had accounted for. When she offered suggestions, they were met with resistance at first, but as her solutions took root and the improvements became visible, resistance gave way to grudging respect. Within weeks, the department that had been languishing began to show signs of recovery. Processes ran smoother, employees found themselves working with greater clarity, and profits began to climb. Adrian watched it all with quiet pride, careful not to reveal too much of his role. He had placed her in a position where she could prove herself, but it was her effort alone that carried her forward. He saw the same determination that had once driven her on the frozen streets now ignite in conference rooms and offices. Her presence changed the atmosphere of the department. People who had been resigned to decline now carried themselves with renewed energy, inspired by her discipline and calm authority. She had not only found her footing again, she had lifted others with her. The transformation was not swift, but steady, like the thaw of winter into spring. Weeks turned into months, and by the end of the first quarter, her department had surpassed projections no one had thought possible. Reports showed profits where once there had been losses, and whispers of doubt were replaced by quiet admiration. She had not merely survived, she had reclaimed her identity as a professional, a leader, a woman of intelligence and capability. For Adrian, each success deepened the quiet affection that had already taken root in him. He had admired her strength in survival, but now he admired her brilliance in triumph. She was no longer the woman bent over icy windshields, though he knew that woman would always live in her. She was Elena restored, a woman who had faced ruin and rebuilt herself from the ground. Watching her command respect in meetings, seeing her navigate obstacles with clarity, he realized that his decision to trust her had been more than justified. It had been inevitable. She was born not to scrape survival from the cold, but to shape futures. The nights they had once shared on the street were behind them, but Adrian carried them with him still. Those nights had shown him who she truly was, and now the office revealed the full measure of what she could be. His admiration had ripened into something deeper, something he could no longer deny even to himself. He loved her, not the idea of her, not the role she played, but the entirety of her being, forged in hardship and revealed in triumph. As spring edged its way into the city, Adrian knew that the time was approaching when he would no longer be able to hide the truth. The deception of omission, though born of fear, could not last forever. If their bond was to grow into what he hoped, she would need to know who he truly was. But for now, he allowed himself the quiet joy of watching her flourish, content to stand in the shadows while she reclaimed her light. The months that followed brought a rhythm Adrian had not known he craved. He spent his days surrounded by the clamor of business, the endless meetings and calculations that defined his empire. But within that familiar world, something had shifted. Where once numbers had seemed to him like trophies, hollow affirmations of victory, now they carried a weight because he saw in them the mark of her hand. Elena had not only lifted a struggling department, she had transformed it into one of the most profitable branches of the company. Colleagues who had sneered at her entry now leaned on her insight. Executives who had dismissed her as an experiment whispered admiration behind closed doors. Yet for all her accomplishments, she remained grounded, moving through the corridors with the same quiet composure she had carried in the cold streets. Adrian watched her grow into herself again, and with every passing day his pride was threaded with something deeper, something tender and restless. He had thought he could contain it, could remain the silent benefactor who gave her the stage and stood content in the shadows. But the truth had become a weight he could no longer ignore. He had hidden who he was out of fear of shattering the fragile trust that had blossomed between them, fear of becoming in her eyes nothing more than a wealthy man indulging in a charity project. But as her success solidified, as her presence in the company became undeniable, Adrian realized that the very deception meant to protect her dignity now threatened to undo everything. A relationship built on omission, no matter how noble the intention, could not endure. The decision to tell her came not in a moment of clarity, but in the weariness of knowing he could not wait any longer. It was evening when he asked her to meet him, not in the polished walls of the company, but in a small cafe far from the glare of downtown. She arrived with the same guarded dignity she carried everywhere, though now there was a confidence in her that had not been present months before. She had rediscovered her worth, and it showed in the steadiness of her gaze. Adrian, seeing her sit across from him, felt the gravity of what he was about to confess pressed down on him harder than any boardroom confrontation he had ever faced. He spoke slowly, carefully, but without retreat. He told her his name was not simply Adrian, a man who happened upon her in the cold, but Adrian Cole, the man who owned the very company where she now worked. He told her that when he had first stepped beside her with a sponge in hand, he had hidden his identity because he wanted to be treated not as a benefactor, not as a symbol of wealth, but simply as another pair of hands. He admitted the fear that had guided his silence, the desire to protect the honesty of their connection, and then he fell silent, bracing for the storm he knew might follow. For a long time, Elena said nothing. The quiet stretched between them, heavy and unforgiving. Her eyes searched his face as if trying to trace the truth across his features, as if seeking proof in the lines of his expression. At last she drew a slow breath. The betrayal she had endured in the past had left her wary of lies, of half-truths, of masks. Yet as she considered him, she saw not a man who had deceived for gain, but one who had concealed out of fear of losing something fragile and precious. It was not cruelty that had silenced him, but vulnerability. That realization softened the edges of her suspicion, though it did not erase them entirely. She asked why he had chosen her, why he had bent his back beside hers in the frost, when he could have passed by without a second thought. And his answer was simple. Because in her he had seen the strength that wealth could never buy, the dignity that no misfortune could erase. He had fallen in love with that strength before he had allowed himself to name it love. The admission changed something in the air. She lowered her eyes for a moment, her hand brushing against the rim of her cup, and then she lifted her gaze again with a clarity that startled him. She told him she could not love him for his wealth, nor for the security he offered. If she loved him, and the words came slowly, carefully, it would be for the man who had stood with her in the snow, who had taken the sponge in his hands without a word, who had proven that his pride could be set aside to share her burden. And as she spoke, Adrian felt something loosen inside him, a knot that had bound his chest for months unraveling at last. From that night onward, their bond was no longer unspoken. It grew in the open, no longer hidden by silence or fear. They shared their days not only in the corridors of the company, but in stolen hours where laughter came easier, where Daniel's small voice joined them, where the ordinary moments of life became more precious than all the contracts in Adrian's possession. He discovered joy in simplicity again, joy in evenings spent in a modest apartment, with Elena reading by lamplight while Daniel dozed nearby. She discovered that love could exist without betrayal, that trust could grow where once she thought it impossible. Their union was not sudden but steady, a weaving together of lives tested by fire and frost. When at last they chose to marry, it was not with the grandeur that many expected of a man of Adrian's wealth, though the world would have gladly celebrated it with opulence. Instead, the ceremony was intimate, filled with the few who mattered, those who had seen them through hardship. Elena wore no jewels but carried herself with the radiance of someone who had survived ruin and emerged stronger. Adrian, standing beside her, felt not the pride of ownership, but the humility of gratitude that she had chosen him, not the empire behind his name. In the months that followed their marriage, they turned their gaze outward. The memory of where they had begun, the frozen street, the bucket of water, the child tied close to his mother, remained too vivid to be ignored. Together, they founded a center for women who found themselves in the same desperate place Elena once had been. It was more than charity. It was a lifeline. Women arrived with children in their arms and fear in their eyes, and they found not pity, but opportunity. They found training, resources, and the dignity of work that honored their strength. Elena herself walked among them, not as a figurehead, but as one who understood their struggle, offering both guidance and proof that survival could become triumph. The opening day of the center was etched into Adrian's heart as deeply as any success of his career. He stood beside Elaine at the entrance, Daniel's small hand clutching his, and watched as a young mother stepped hesitantly inside. She carried a child no older than Daniel had been when Adrian first saw him, wrapped in a thin blanket against the wind. The sight struck him with the echo of that first night, the steam rising from icy water, the determination in Elena's eyes. He felt her hand slip into his, warm and steady, and when he turned to her, he saw that same determination now tempered with hope. Their story had begun in silence, in frost and exhaustion, in the unlikely companionship of two people who had no reason to meet. It had grown through trust and trial, through concealment and confession, through survival and renewal. And now, standing together as partners in love and in purpose, they knew their journey was only beginning. The wealth that once defined Adrian now seemed like the least of his possessions. What mattered was the woman beside him, the child they guided, and the lives they touched together. For in the end, it was not fortune that bound them, but the simple truth revealed on a winter street, that dignity endures, love grows strongest in hardship, and two souls, once strangers, can find in each other the chance to begin again. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories, and stay tuned for what's coming soon. And please, share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.